What if everything we know today, our science, our medicine, our technology, was just a shadow of what we once knew? What if humanity had already touched the stars, charted the seas, and mapped the human soul, only to forget it all, not because of time, not because of natural disaster, but because someone was afraid of knowledge? Before we begin our story, let me ask, how was your day? Whether it was calm or chaotic, easy or a little heavy, you made it through. And I'm proud of you for that. This is your time now, a gentle space to slow down, to breathe, and to let the world soften around you. If you'd like, feel free to share how you're feeling in the comments. I'm always here to listen. And if you enjoy these quiet bedtime stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me again next time. Now, settle in, let the day drift away, and let's begin our story. Let me take you back. The sun is setting over the shimmering coastline of Egypt. 2,000 years ago, the port of Alexandria hums softly. Boats unloading spices, scrolls, instruments from faraway lands. Merchants argue in Greek, sailors sing in Egyptian, and amid it all rises something almost surreal. Not a castle, not a temple, not a fortress, but a library, a building of knowledge so vast, so audacious, that even the gods would have paused at its doors. They called it the Library of Alexandria. But this wasn't just a library. It was the greatest repository of human thought ever attempted, a dream given brick and breath, a beacon to minds from across the ancient world, a place where borders meant nothing and curiosity meant everything. Historians believe it held anywhere from 400,000 to 1 million scrolls, each one handwritten, unique and irreplaceable. That may not sound like much today, but in the ancient world, a single scroll could represent the entire known knowledge of a subject. Imagine a library that contained everything from Egyptian medicine to Indian cosmology, from Greek philosophy to Babylonian mathematics, all in one place. It was the internet before the internet, and it vanished now. Here's the part you've probably heard. The Library of Alexandria burned to the ground in a great fire. Maybe it was Julius Caesar. Maybe it was Christian zealots. Maybe it was just one big accident. That's the textbook version. Clean, simplified, safe, but real history. It's rarely so neat, because the real reason the Library of Alexandria disappeared isn't one fire, one villain, or one dramatic night. It's a slow, tragic unraveling, a death by 1,000 silences, and underneath that silence lies something deliberate. Let's pause here. Ask yourself, why would someone destroy a place that preserved wisdom? What did it contain that scared people so much? The truth is, it wasn't just about scrolls. It was about what those scrolls represented. Ideas, power, disobedience, liberation. You see, knowledge is dangerous. It questions things. It pokes holes in the stories emperors tell. It whispers alternatives. It refuses to bow. And for those in power, that's terrifying. Inside the library, there were theories about the Earth revolving around the Sun 1,700 years before Galileo. There were anatomical drawings that challenged religious beliefs about the human body. There were maps that hinted at unknown continents. There were scrolls that questioned slavery, hierarchy, even gods. It's one thing to store knowledge, it's another thing to dare to believe it. And in Alexandria, they dared, but not everyone wanted that. Outside the library's marble walls, something was shifting. Slowly, rulers began to see the library not as a treasure, but as a threat. and threats are removed. That's why we're telling this story, not because it's ancient, but because it's still happening every time a book is banned, a journalist is silenced, or a voice is drowned out by noise. We're living the same story again. The library didn't just burn. It was buried, one piece at a time, silently, politically, intentionally. Some scrolls were lost in battles. Some were moved and never returned. Some were destroyed in riots. Some were simply never copied again. And eventually, the light dimmed. The scholars left. The ideas faded. The silence grew. And no one remembered the day it ended, because there was no day, just absence. And that's the most haunting part of all. When something so massive dies without a funeral, the world moves on without realizing what it lost. Let me ask you, what might have been in those scrolls? Cures for diseases, blueprints for machines, philosophies that could have prevented war? We'll never know, but we can uncover how it happened and why. Because when you understand how the world's greatest library was allowed to die, you begin to see the warning signs in our own world. So stay with me. In the next section, we'll return to the very beginning, to the dream of Alexander the Great, to the ambition of kings, to the city that dared to build a sanctuary for thought, because only by understanding what the library was, can we grasp what it meant, and maybe what we must protect now. To understand how something so magnificent could be lost, we first need to understand what it was. Not just a library, but a vision, a dream whispered by one man, carried forward by others, built stone by stone, scroll by scroll, idea by idea. Let's rewind to the 4th century BCE. The world is chaotic. Empires rise and fall like waves on a stormy sea. But in the middle of it all is a young man with a wild idea, a man named Alexander of Macedon, who the world would later call the Great, but not because he conquered, not because he ruled, because he imagined. Alexander didn't just want to build an empire, he wanted to unify one. He believed the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Persians, and the Indians, with all their differences, could still learn from one another. That knowledge, not war, would build something eternal. So in 331 BCE, on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, Alexander stood on an empty stretch of land and pointed. "Here," he said, "build me a city that will outlive kings." And they did. They called it Alexandria. It became a fusion of East and West. Greek columns beside Egyptian obelisks, temples beside amphitheaters, markets filled with herbs from India and gold from Nubia. But the real treasure was still to come. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt, and Ptolemy had a different obsession. He wanted to build something no one had ever dared before, a place that held all the world's knowledge. Let that sink in. Every scroll, every theory, every poem, every record of every kingdom in one place. Not just for his own glory, but to preserve the soul of civilization. So, around 288 BCE, the Library of Alexandria was born. Not just a room with books, a cathedral of knowledge, attached to a larger institution called the Mauseon, a place dedicated to the muses, the divine inspirations of art and science. The Mauseon wasn't just a library, it was a university, a laboratory, a debating hall, a research institute, and a sanctuary all in one. Inside were gardens, dining halls, lecture rooms, observatories. Scholars lived there full time, their food and housing paid for by the state, so they could focus entirely on thinking. Can you imagine that? a government funding thinkers just to think. It was radical, it was rare, and it was beautiful. And then came the scrolls. Tens of thousands of them, brought in by land and sea. Every ship that docked at the port of Alexandria was searched if it carried scrolls. They were copied by trained scribes, and the originals were stored in the library. Yes, you heard that right. They didn't ask for permission. Alexandria's mission was so obsessive, so driven, that they didn't wait for donations. They took knowledge, copied it, preserved it, and often kept the originals. And people sent their works willingly to kings from across the ancient world, gifted rare writings, Babylonian star charts, Indian texts on medicine, Venetian treatises on trade. Even Aristotle's private collection was said to have made its way into the library. Imagine walking through those halls. Thousands of scrolls in every direction. Some of them so old they predate empires. Some so new they're still drying. A scholar from Athens argues astronomy with a priest from Thebes. A translator recites Persian poetry beside a mathematician sketching conic sections. Outside, birds chirp in the gardens. The sea breeze rustles palm leaves above the marble colonnades. And inside, history is being remembered. Future is being imagined. This wasn't just a storehouse of paper. It was the mind of humanity, breathing, thinking, evolving, and the people who came here were some of the most brilliant the world had ever seen. Eratosthenes, the man who calculated the Earth's circumference with just shadows and a stick. Hero of Alexandria, who may have invented the world's first steam engine. Almost 2,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. Callimachus, the first librarian to attempt a classification system for knowledge. And later, Hypatia, a woman who taught philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy to students from every corner of the empire. Their goal wasn't fame, it was understanding. But here's the catch. When people start understanding too much, someone else usually starts feeling threatened. Because Alexandria wasn't just creating knowledge, it was challenging the world outside. It dared to say, what if the gods aren't responsible for disease? What if the stars don't predict our fate, but follow math? What if the earth isn't the center of everything? And, for some, that was too dangerous to tolerate. So while inside the library, scholars debated the shape of the cosmos. Outside, in the streets, people whispered. They mock the gods. They question tradition. They think they're better than us. And like smoke under a door, those whispers grew. They became suspicion. Suspicion became tension. And tension would one day become fire. But for now, in this golden moment, Alexandria flourished. The library became more than a building. It became a symbol of what humanity could be when curiosity was allowed to bloom. But dreams like that, they don't survive on their own. They need protection. They need belief. And most of all, they need freedom. In the next section, we'll meet the people who lived inside this miracle. Not kings, not conquerors, but the quiet revolutionaries, the thinkers, the dreamers, the ones who knew too much. The scrolls didn't write themselves. The knowledge didn't arrive by accident. The Library of Alexandria was more than stone and parchment. It was powered by people, thinkers, wanderers, scientists, poets, philosophers, astronomers, mathematicians. Some were invited. Some just showed up. All of them were seeking something bigger than themselves. But not everyone outside those walls believed in that kind of seeking. And that's where this story begins to shift from wonder to danger. Because the people inside the library, they knew too much. Imagine you're a young student in Alexandria. You wake up early in the Mausian dormitories. The sun is just rising over the harbor. Outside your window you hear the creak of boats, the squonk of gulls, the soft murmurs of other scholars already deep in conversation. Your days are filled with debate, discovery, and exploration. One morning, you're listening to Eratosthenes, the chief librarian. He's showing you two sticks, one in Alexandria, one in Syene, and explaining how the difference in their shadows at noon proves that the Earth is curved. Not just that, he's calculated the planet's circumference, and he's only off by a few hundred kilometers. In the 3rd century BCE, centuries before anyone would sail around the world another day, you sit beside Hero of Alexandria, watching in awe as steam pours from a small metal sphere. It spins on its axis. He calls it an olopile. It looks like magic, but it's science. The first steam-powered machine in recorded history. Then there's Aristarchus, proposing that the Earth orbits the Sun, and Hipparchus, charting the stars with such precision that modern astronomers still marvel at his data. Each of these scholars, generations apart, contributed to a chain of knowledge so deep, so connected, that it rivals anything we've created today. And then there was Hypatia, a woman in a world ruled by men, a teacher of mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, a beacon of intellect in an age where truth was beginning to fall under suspicion. Her very presence at the library was revolutionary. She wasn't just a symbol of brilliance. She was a threat to those who feared the kind of world she represented, a world where reason mattered more than rank, where logic questioned authority, where no idea was too sacred to examine. And that's exactly why it couldn't last, you see. When people start unraveling the universe, not everyone applauds. Outside the library's marbled halls, tension was growing. Religious fundamentalism was spreading. Political control was tightening. And suddenly, knowledge wasn't seen as noble. It was seen as rebellion. Imagine a scroll that claims the sun is just one of many stars, and Earth is not the center. To a ruler who claims divine authority from heaven, what does that mean? It means threat. Or a physician who says that diseases aren't caused by gods, but by biology. To a high priest, that's blasphemy. And so, slowly, the scholars became dangerous. They weren't wielding swords. They were wielding truth. And truth is sharper than any blade, because it cuts through illusion. The problem wasn't what they knew. The problem was that they shared it. Their scrolls spread. Their lectures inspired. Their students carried ideas back to their home cities, Persia, Greece, Carthage, Judea, and with every whispered theory, every copied diagram, every translated line of poetry or science, the old world started to crack. Let's be clear, the library wasn't perfect. It was funded by royalty. It existed within the privilege of empire. Some scholars were arrogant, elitist, even dismissive of other cultures. Not every scroll inside was accurate or free from bias, but the idea that knowledge should be gathered, questioned, preserved, that was revolutionary, and that idea was starting to scare the world outside, in the markets of Alexandria. People began whispering that the scholars had lost their faith. In temples, priests warned that the library was eroding belief. In courtrooms, politicians murmured that intellectuals were becoming too influential. And in dark corners, a new strategy began to form. If you can't silence an idea with logic, you silence it with fear. One by one, the scholars began to disappear. Some were accused of heresy. Some were exiled quietly. Some simply vanished from the record. And still, inside the library, Those who remained kept writing, not because they thought they were safe, but because they believed that truth was worth the risk. Can you imagine that kind of courage? To speak when speaking could mean death, to calculate, theorize, debate, and publish, while knowing that outside your door, the world was turning against you. These weren't rebels with banners. They were rebels with pens, and history shows us again and again. Those are the ones who change the world, but they're also the ones who tend to die first. By the late 4th century CE, the Library of Alexandria wasn't just a center of learning anymore. It was a battleground, a war between old power and new truth. The scholars inside weren't just thinking anymore, they were resisting. And in the next section, we'll see how the idea of a single fire destroying the library is, in many ways, a lie, because the real story isn't one of burning. It's a story of slow erasure, political manipulation, and fear turning to violence. A story where silence was louder than flames. A story where truth was the first thing to die. Let's talk about the fire. Because when most people hear Library of Alexandria, they think of one thing: flames, a great roaring inferno, scrolls turning to ash, centuries of wisdom erased in a single night. It's dramatic, tragic, and mostly incomplete, because the truth is, there was not one single fire. There were many, and the biggest one didn't even destroy the library. It's 48 BCE. Rome is in chaos. Civil war has broken out between Julius Caesar and Pompey. Pompey, once Caesar's ally, is now his rival. He flees to Egypt seeking safety, but Egypt, trying to impress Caesar, betrays him. Pompey is murdered on the shores of Alexandria. Caesar arrives soon after. And what begins as political maneuvering quickly spirals into violence. Riots erupt in the streets. Hostilities ignite between Caesar's troops and the Alexandrians. To secure his position, Caesar takes the royal palace. But as the fighting intensifies, he's cornered, desperate. Caesar orders the Egyptian fleet in the harbor to be burned, a strategic move to stop enemy reinforcements. But fire, like fear, doesn't obey commands. The flames spread fast. They leap from ship to shore, from dock to market, and soon to the warehouses near the port. These warehouses, historians believe, stored scrolls awaiting translation for the library. Not the library itself, but part of its system. Thousands of texts, gone in smoke. Let's pause. Yes, this was a loss. Yes, it was devastating. But it wasn't the end. The main library, believed to be housed inside the royal district near the Mausian, survived, at least for now. So why do so many people think Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria? Because, centuries later, historians like Plutarch, Dio Cassius, and others began to retell the story with less certainty and more flair than the retelling. The storehouses became the library. The scrolls in transit became all scrolls. And over time, the nuance was lost. It's easier to remember a single villain, a single night, a single fire. It gives the tragedy a clean arc, a headline. But reality rarely fits in a headline. After Caesar's fire, Alexandria still stood. And so did the library. In fact, over the next 400 years, we find evidence that scholars were still studying there, writing, teaching, preserving. So what happened? Why did the library eventually vanish? Because fires can burn without flames, and Alexandria's scrolls would face something much slower and much more dangerous. Let's talk about political erosion after Caesar. The Roman Empire absorbed Egypt, and with it came a shift in priorities. The emperors in Rome didn't value Alexandria like the Ptolemies had. The library became less of a jewel and more of an antique. Resources dwindled. Funding dried up. Scrolls decayed, uncopied. Scholars left. Some fled. Some were pressured. Some were forgotten. There was no single attack, no bomb, no dramatic theft. Just neglect. Knowledge doesn't need fire to die. It just needs to be ignored. Then came the rise of Christianity in the Roman world. At first, Christians were the persecuted, hunted, executed, exiled. But by the 4th century CE, things flipped. Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity, and suddenly, the persecuted became the powerful. This shift had profound consequences for the library, because many Christian leaders viewed pagan texts, especially ones questioning the cosmos, the soul, or creation, as dangerous, heretical, even demonic. The Church's truth was no longer to be debated. It was to be obeyed, and the library, it became a target of suspicion. It's important to note, not all Christians wanted to destroy knowledge. Some became its greatest preservers, but in this period of transition, fear was louder than nuance, and into this rising storm stepped a mob. It's 391 CE, a new bishop of Alexandria, Theophilus, is given imperial permission to destroy pagan temples. Statues are smashed, shrines are toppled, rituals are banned. Among the casualties is the Serapeum, a grand temple dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god, Serapis. Some historians believe the secondary scroll depository was located within or beside the Serapeum, and during the riots, it was destroyed. Flames again, but not of strategy this time, of rage. Was this the main library? Probably not, but it was a piece of it, and piece by piece. The great vision of Alexandria began to crumble, not in a single night, not by a single man, but by a society slowly turning its back on curiosity. And still, that wasn't the end. Even into the early 5th century, figures like Hypatia were still teaching philosophy and astronomy in Alexandria. But the world was changing too fast. Political power, religious dogma, public fear, the pillars of the library, logic, reason, dialogue, were no longer safe. And so, when the final blows came, there was almost nothing left to save. Let's be honest. The idea that Julius Caesar burned everything is a comforting myth, because it gives us a villain. It lets us sleep at night thinking, one bad man made one bad choice. What a tragedy. But the truth, the library died slowly, because the world stopped wanting it to live. Ideas were no longer welcome, and without air, even the brightest flame flickers out. In the next section, we'll step into that ideological storm where religion, power, and fear collided, and where knowledge paid the price. Because it wasn't just scrolls that were targeted, it was the freedom to think. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, it comes from fear. By the end of the 4th century CE, Alexandria was no longer the city of whispered discoveries and open scrolls. It had become a city of whispers and warnings. Something was shifting in the soul of the empire. Once, curiosity was sacred. Now, obedience was. When Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire, it wasn't just a change in faith. It was a change in how truth was defined, no longer debated in libraries, but declared from pulpits. And suddenly, the scholars of Alexandria found themselves walking a tightrope. The library, once a monument to every idea, now found itself surrounded by a world that demanded just one truth, one God, one version of reality. Let's be clear, Christianity wasn't the villain. Like any powerful belief system, it had both protectors and destroyers. What mattered was who wielded it. And in Alexandria, power had shifted. Religious leaders now held influence that emperors once did, and some of them saw the library not as a light, but as a flame that needed to be extinguished. Imagine being a librarian in this world. You walk through rows of scrolls, ancient Egyptian medicine, Greek philosophy, Hindu cosmology, knowledge that challenges, contradicts, complicates. Outside, mobs chant hymns. They see your scrolls as blasphemy. They don't understand what's written on them, and they don't want to, because they've been told something simple. If it isn't from God, it's from the devil. And your scrolls, they question God. They offer other gods. They say the earth moves, that stars are just balls of gas, that the soul may not be eternal. Your scrolls make people ask questions. But outside, no one wants questions. They want certainty. Certainty is intoxicating. It's comforting. It tells people who they are, who's good, who's bad, what's true, and anything or anyone that disrupts that clarity becomes a threat. The library had become that threat. Its scrolls held thousands of different perspectives, but the new world wanted just one, so they began to whisper. The library is pagan. The scholars are heretics. They worship knowledge instead of God. Fear spreads like ink on parchment. It seeps into markets, into sermons, into city halls. Soon, the scholars weren't just ignored. They were hated, and then they were hunted. Let's talk about Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria, in 391 CE. Emperor Theodosius I gave him permission to destroy all pagan temples in Egypt. Theophilus didn't hesitate. He rallied his followers and marched through the city. They desecrated shrines, shattered statues, and burned temples that had stood for centuries. Among them, the Sivippium, a towering temple of worship and learning. Some historians believe the Sivippium housed part of the library's collection, perhaps a secondary scroll repository. If true, this wasn't just an attack on faith. It was a massacre of memory. Scrolls, statues, sacred objects, all turned to ash. Why? Because Theophilus and others like him believed that in order to build the kingdom of heaven, you had to erase the world that came before it. They weren't just cleansing the city, they were rewriting it. But the story didn't end with Theophilus. His nephew would take things even further. His name was Cyril. He became bishop after his uncle's death, and he believed deeply that there could be no peace while pagans and heretics still walked freely in Alexandria, and standing in his way was a woman. Her name was Hypatia. You've heard her name before in this story. A philosopher, a mathematician, a scientist, and above all, a teacher. Hypatia wasn't just respected. She was loved by Christians, pagans, and even government officials. But her very presence was defiance. A woman leading minds, challenging authority, refusing to submit to dogma. She represented the final flickering flame of Alexandria's intellectual spirit, and in 415 CE, that flame was extinguished one morning. As Hypatia rode through the city in her chariot, she was stopped by a mob. Christian zealots, loyal to Cyril, dragged her into a church. There, they stripped her, beat her with tiles, and tore her body apart with sharp shells. Her remains were burned, her writings lost, her students scattered, her memory almost erased. The city that once protected minds now punished them, and with Hypatia's death, the last public scholar of the Alexandrian tradition was gone. No fire was needed, just fear and the silence that followed. But let's not oversimplify. This wasn't just religion versus science. That's too neat, the deeper truth. It was power versus questioning, religious power, political power, cultural power, and the library and everyone who walked its halls asked questions that power didn't want answered. What if God is not who you say he is? What if your kingdom isn't eternal? What if your laws are wrong? What if the people start to think for themselves? The fire didn't come from scrolls igniting. It came from fragile men who couldn't stand the idea of a world that didn't center them. That's the real reason the library died. Not because ideas are weak, but because they're strong enough to scare tyrants. In the next section, we'll step into the aftermath, the quiet years, when the library still technically stood, but no one walked its halls, no one taught, no one dared to think too loudly, because when you kill the thinkers, the books don't need to burn, they simply rot. In every great tragedy, there is a final moment, not always a fire, not always a war. Sometimes it's a single life, a voice, a presence, a woman riding through the city with scrolls beneath her arm and stars in her eyes. Her name was Hypatia, and she was the last light of the Library of Alexandria. To understand why she mattered so much and why her death still echoes, we have to step into her world. The year is 370 CE. Alexandria is no longer the city of unchallenged knowledge. It once was. The golden age of scroll copying and philosophical debate has dimmed, but it hasn't gone out. In a quiet hall, lined with aging texts and sun-drenched columns, a young girl sits beside her father, Theon of Alexandria, one of the last known mathematicians of the library. He teaches her geometry, astronomy, philosophy, but more than that, he teaches her something sacred: to ask questions. She listens, she learns. She doesn't just memorize, she understands, and soon she surpasses him. By her 20s, Hypatia is already known across Alexandria as a teacher, but not in the traditional sense. She doesn't preach from a pulpit or stand behind a podium. She walks the streets in her scholar's robe, head high, unafraid. She welcomes students into her home, regardless of faith or background. She teaches Neoplatonism, a philosophy that blends logic, ethics, and the mysteries of existence. But she's not limited by philosophy. She charts the stars. She studies the movement of celestial bodies. She designs astrolabe's tools to navigate by starlight. She refines equations passed down from Greek and Babylonian thinkers. Her presence is radical, not just because she's a philosopher, but because she's a woman. In a world that told women to remain silent, she became the most respected voice in Alexandria. Her lectures were legendary. People from across the empire came to hear her. Pagans, Christians, even government officials. And they didn't just admire her knowledge, they admired her character. Hypatia was kind, fair, honest, uncompromising in her search for truth. She wasn't a rebel with fire, she was a scholar with light, and for a while that light held back the dark. But outside her lectures, the city was unraveling. Alexandria had become a powder keg of religion and politics. The old Roman system was decaying. The new Christian authorities were struggling to control a restless population. Factions of zealots began to rise, groups who believed that anyone who questioned the church, even with reason, was dangerous. And in this volatile mix, Cyril, the Bishop of Alexandria, gained power. He was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly convinced that Alexandria needed to be purified of non-Christian influence. That meant temples, that meant Roman loyalists, and eventually, that meant Hypatia. At first, it was whispers. She's too influential. She consorts with Roman officials. She practices pagan magic. She teaches things that oppose scripture. It didn't matter that none of it was true. It mattered that it felt true to people desperate for control. And then came the turning point. In 415 CE, a power struggle erupted between Cyril and the Roman governor of Egypt, Orestes, a Christian, who also happened to be a student of Hypatia. Their conflict was political on the surface, but it quickly turned ideological. Cyril's followers began accusing Hypatia of manipulating Orestes, of preventing peace, of poisoning the soul of the city with her pagan logic, and soon the whispers turned into rage. One March morning, Hypatia climbs into her chariot as usual. She's heading toward the academy, scrolls beside her, the sea breeze cool on her face. But on this morning, the streets are quiet. Too quiet. Suddenly, a group of men step in front of her path. Christian zealots, members of a group known as the Parabolani, a kind of religious militia loyal to Cyril. They drag her from her chariot, tear her robe, beat her with roof tiles and oyster shells, tools sharp enough to wound, but slow enough to prolong agony. She cries out, not for mercy, but for truth. They strip the skin from her body, burn her remains, scatter her ashes into the wind, and in that moment, Alexandria loses more than a woman, it loses its soul. Let that settle in. This wasn't just a murder. It was a ritual erasure, a warning to anyone who dared to think, to question, to believe that knowledge could stand apart from doctrine. Hypatia. Death wasn't the moment the library fell, but it was the moment its spirit died, because after her, no one dared to teach publicly again. No one dared to question loudly. No one dared to walk the streets of Alexandria with scrolls and stars in their eyes. Some say Hypatia's writings were preserved. Some say they were lost forever. But perhaps her most powerful message was never written at all. It was in the way she lived, with grace, with intellect, with courage. And maybe that's why the silence after her death was so loud. Because a society that kills its teachers doesn't just forget what they taught. It forgets how to learn. In the next section, we'll explore what happened after the screams faded and the smoke cleared. Not fire, not protest, just dust, just silence. Because the most dangerous way to kill knowledge is to let it die unnoticed. When people imagine the end of the Library of Alexandria, they picture fire, crackling, roaring, final. But what if the real tragedy wasn't fire? What if it was dust? Dust, slowly gathering on shelves, no one touched anymore. Ideas that no longer sparked debates, but sat in silence. Ink fading, not from flames, but from forgetfulness. This is how most great things die, not with a scream, but with a whimper. After Hypatia was killed, Alexandria didn't explode, it dimmed. The scholars were gone, the debates had stopped, and no one quite knew what to do with what remained. There were still scrolls, there were still buildings, but they no longer meant anything. The library, once a heartbeat, had become a husk. You see, people often look for drama in history, the big moment, the big villain, the big blaze. But the most chilling kind of destruction is bureaucratic, quiet, procedural, unemotional, scrolls misfiled, manuscripts never recopied, funding cut, buildings repurposed, scholars reassigned, ideas no longer seen as dangerous, but simply useless. And that's what happened. Without minds to read them, scrolls are just paper. Without purpose, a library becomes just a building. And so, one by one, the lights inside Alexandria began to go out. Let's talk about entropy in science. Entropy is the natural tendency of systems to fall into disorder, and in history, entropy wears the face of neglect. Imagine a scroll copied 3 times a century to preserve its accuracy. But now, the scribe who did that work is dead, and no one has replaced him. The ink fades, the papyrus crumbles, the language is no longer spoken, and eventually, even if the scroll survives, no one can read it. Isn't that a kind of death? What about the people? The students once walked miles to study at the library. Now, they walk past it. There are no lectures, no gatherings, no scholars coming from India or Greece or Babylon. There are new centers of power now. Constantinople, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria has become a shadow of what it once was, a reminder not of greatness, but of what greatness couldn't survive. Let's go deeper, because this wasn't just the death of a library, this was the death of a method. Before, Alexandria believed in something radical, that truth should be searched for, not declared, that disagreement was not a threat, but a spark, that no belief was above question, no law immune to reason, no God so sacred that he couldn't be debated with humility. That's what the library really stood for, and when it fell, it wasn't just the scrolls that disappeared, it was that culture, the culture of curiosity, was replaced with certainty, the kind that doesn't ask, doesn't wonder, doesn't grow. It would be hundreds of years before the Renaissance revived some of what Alexandria had once been. But even then, much was already lost. Imagine the books that were never written, because the books that inspired them were gone. Imagine the discoveries delayed by centuries, because the formula was burned before it could be shared. Imagine the students who never became scholars, because they were born into a world that no longer valued thinking. That's the cost of silent erasure. And here's the hardest part to swallow. No one noticed when the library finally died. There was no closing ceremony, no torch passed, no plaque hung. It just slipped away. One day, someone walked by the great halls, and they were empty. The doors closed, the pages quiet, and no one could remember the last time they were read. You don't have to burn a book to destroy it. You just have to make people afraid to open it, or convince them it's no longer relevant. That's what silence does. It doesn't scream, it whispers. This doesn't matter anymore. It's just old words. What good is all this learning anyway? And so, the greatest treasure of human history disappeared, not into flame, but into forgetfulness. We often imagine history being written with blood or fire, but it's also erased with dust, and laziness, and fear, and agendas. You don't always need a villain. Sometimes, all it takes is disinterest. And when that happens, even the brightest minds, the boldest dreams, the wisest scrolls fade like footprints in sand. In the next section, we'll turn our eyes not to the past, but to what could have been. What did we lose, truly? Not just scrolls, not just buildings, but futures. Because what if buried in those lost pages was the key to changing the world far earlier than we ever did. We often measure history by what happened, but sometimes the most haunting chapters are the ones that didn't. We look back at the ruins of Alexandria, the scrolls that turned to dust, and the voices that were silenced, and we ask, what if? What if those ideas had survived? What if they had spread, instead of disappearing into silence? What kind of world would we live in now? Because the truth is, we didn't just lose books, we lost futures. Let's start with one name, Hero of Alexandria, a brilliant engineer and mathematician. He lived around the 1st century CE, and in his notebooks, he described something astonishing. A steam-powered engine, yes. A small, rotating metal sphere powered by boiling water. Today, we call it the Eolipile. But in its time, it was more than a toy. It was potential. Potential for engines, for locomotion, for machines that could power the future. And yet, nothing happened. The idea was noted, admired, and then forgotten, because the system, the ecosystem of thinkers, builders, was already falling apart. There were no industrial revolutions in ancient Alexandria, no factories, no railroads, not because they weren't imaginable, but because the spark never found kindling. Now, imagine this. What if the Industrial Revolution happened in 100 CE instead of 1750? Imagine steamships in the Roman Empire, printing presses in ancient India, global trade, automation, early electricity, not in the 18th century, but in the 3rd. Imagine the internet, 1,000 years earlier. It sounds like science fiction, but it isn't, because the blueprints were already beginning to form. They just needed one thing: time. Time to be debated, to be tested, to evolve. And that time was stolen. Then there's astronomy. Long before Copernicus and Galileo, ancient scholars in Alexandria were already wondering, what if the Earth isn't the center of the universe? Aristarchus of Samos, working centuries before Christ, proposed a heliocentric model that the Earth orbits the Sun. He was ignored. His writings faded. The theory was rediscovered 1,800 years later. Think about that. Nearly 2 millennia of misunderstanding the cosmos, because we buried a scroll. What about medicine? Alexandrian physicians dissected bodies, studied organs, mapped the brain, recorded procedures in stunning detail. They understood that disease had natural causes, not just curses or spirits. One physician, Herophilos, identified the brain as the center of thought, not the heart, in the 3rd century BCE, and yet, his work was lost. Instead, Europe spent centuries relying on outdated models and superstition leeches, bloodletting, mystical humors. What could modern medicine have looked like if Herophilos had become the father of neuroscience? What diseases could we have cured 1,000 years earlier? The tragedy isn't just what we lost, it's how long it took us to catch back up. We like to think of history as a staircase upward, always forward. But history isn't a staircase, it's a loop. We rise, we fall, we forget, we rediscover. Alexandria had knowledge that we only relearned in the last few centuries, and some of it we may never get back, because, unlike modern books, ancient scrolls were unique, handwritten, uncopied, gone forever when lost. Imagine one scroll describing how to build a magnetic compass, another on irrigation systems that could have transformed agriculture, another on surgical techniques. One piece of parchment could have changed everything, and we'll never know which ones we lost. But here's the deeper loss, the emotional one. We lost momentum. Alexandria had built something rare, a belief that truth was worth the risk, that questioning was sacred, that the world could be understood and improved. And that belief wasn't just a philosophy, it was an engine that could have driven humanity forward, faster, earlier, better. Instead, we entered a long, slow sleep. Some call it the Dark Ages, but perhaps a better word is pause, because the mind of the world paused, and when it woke up centuries later, it had to start again from almost nothing. Let's imagine, for a moment, what didn't happen. Maybe cancer research began in 500 CE. Maybe space travel started in the 1400s. Maybe colonialism was checked by earlier global dialogue. Maybe slavery ended centuries sooner because of shared ethics rooted in ancient texts. Maybe the 20th century didn't need 2 world wars, because the wisdom to prevent them had already been written and preserved. Maybe we're not where we're supposed to be. Maybe we're late, because someone let the fire go out. And if all that sounds like fiction, remember, it's only fiction because it didn't happen, because a few scrolls, a few ideas were lost, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient, because they came too soon, because they threatened power, because they made people uncomfortable. In the next section, we'll return to that truth, the real reason the library burned, not just who lit the match, but why they wanted the light gone in the first place. Because knowledge didn't die of age, or accident, or fate. It died because someone needed it to die, and understanding that might change how you see our world today. It's taken us thousands of years to ask the right question. Not when did the Library of Alexandria burn, not how it happened, but why. Why would anyone want to destroy the greatest collection of human knowledge ever assembled? Why would a society, any society, allow the torching, suppression, or erasure of truth? The answer is as old as power itself, because when people become afraid of ideas, they burn the places where those ideas live. The Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed by accident. It wasn't lost to time. It didn't vanish because of one villain. It died because of a much more terrifying force. Insecurity. Let that word settle for a moment. Insecurity. Fear of not being in control. Fear of being proven wrong. Fear of losing authority. You see, the library wasn't just a building full of scrolls. It was a challenge to those in charge, because it suggested that truth doesn't belong to kings or temples or emperors. It belongs to everyone willing to seek it. And if that's true, then what happens to those who claim to speak on behalf of truth? They lose their grip. And so, the library had to go. Let's break it down. The library posed 3 major threats to the power structures of the ancient world. One, it decentralized authority. In a world where religion and empire were absolute, the library offered an alternative: dialogue, debate, dissent. Scrolls from different cultures sat side by side. Gods from different pantheons were analyzed, questioned. Scientific method competed with religious doctrine. This wasn't just intellectual curiosity, it was a direct threat to the monopoly of truth. Because if people begin to realize that there are other ways to think, they stop following blindly. That's not good news for emperors, priests, or generals, too. It empowered the individual. The library didn't just store knowledge, it shared it. A student from Persia could read Greek astronomy. A scholar from India could debate with a philosopher from North Africa. A woman like Hypatia could rise to intellectual prominence. It was meritocratic, and meritocracy is dangerous to any system built on bloodline, caste, or divine appointment. The library whispered, "You can learn anything." But rulers wanted to shout, "You can only learn what we allow." 3. It predicted a different future. The knowledge stored in Alexandria pointed toward a world ruled by ideas, not armies. It hinted at a future driven by steam, stars, and science, not superstition. It imagined medicine without magic, maps without myth, laws without fear, and that future frightened the past, because if that world arrived, the old powers would have no place in it, so they burned it. Not with one match, but with policies, silence, mob violence, and eventually forgetting. One burned a warehouse, another dismantled a temple, another killed a teacher. But the goal was the same: to make the world smaller again, to return to a reality where questioning was treason, where thought was dangerous, where truth came from above, not from within. The fire wasn't about scrolls, it was about control. But here's where the story twists. Because as tragic as the library's fall was, it teaches us something urgent, something we've failed to learn over and over again. That knowledge is not guaranteed. It can be lost, erased, warped, rewritten, and not just by ancient empires, by us, today, right now. Think about it. We live in an age with more access to information than any human before us. But we're also drowning in disinformation. We can Google anything, but we trust less than ever. We scroll for hours, but learn nothing. We have knowledge, but do we protect it? Or are we letting it die again? Not in fire, but in noise. Ask yourself, when books are banned in schools, are we repeating Alexandria? When journalists are jailed, are we silencing the new scrolls? When truth becomes partisan, tribal, weaponized, are we watching the fire start again? Because make no mistake, the same fear that burned Alexandria still lives in every law that limits curiosity, in every system that punishes dissent, in every voice that says, "Don't ask." And every time we stay silent, the match gets a little closer to the page. But there's one thing they never understood. The same thing the rulers and zealots of Alexandria got wrong. You can burn a library, but you can't kill an idea. Ideas are stubborn. They hide in memory. They pass through whispers, stories, data, dreams. Even when scrolls turn to ash, the spark remains, and it waits for someone like you, to light it again. In the next and final section, we'll ask the most important question yet. What are we burning now? Because, if we aren't careful, we might be the ones repeating the tragedy. Not with torches, but with apathy. The Library of Alexandria is gone. Its scrolls, ashes, its walls, crumbled, its scholars, forgotten by most. But its warning, that still flickers. And if you're listening, really listening, it's not just a story about the past, it's a story about right now. Because you don't need fire to burn a library. You just need distraction. Let's look around. Today, we have more access to information than all the ancient empires combined. Knowledge sits in our pockets, in our browsers, in clouds, in cables that stretch across the ocean floor. It's all here, almost to here. And yet, are we smarter, more curious, more connected, wiser? Or have we created a new kind of Alexandria? One made not of stone and scrolls, but of screens and noise. A library made so vast that no one stops to read, because in some ways we're burning it again, only this time we're holding the match ourselves. Every time we click instead of think, every time we share without checking, Every time we attack the person, not the argument. Every time we bury complexity under outrage. Every time we shout louder and listen less. That's not free thinking. That's flamed. And the worst part, we don't even notice what we're losing, because this time, the destruction is invisible. It's happening in the subtle erosion of curiosity, the quiet collapse of trust, the slow death of dialogue. We're not burning scrolls, we're burning attention. Ask yourself, when was the last time you changed your mind about something? When was the last time you read something challenging and sat with it? When was the last time you listened, not to reply, but to understand? Because Alexandria didn't fall all at once. It started small, a bit of censorship here, a bit of apathy there. One teacher silenced, one truth questioned, then ignored. Until one day the doors were closed, and no one even remembered why they were ever open. It's happening again. Right now, in classrooms where history is rewritten, in social media feeds where algorithms choose what we see, in conversations that end before they ever begin, we are being pulled not toward truth, but toward certainty, and certainty, when unchecked, becomes a new kind of dogma. A dogma with no scrolls, no fire, just silence. But here's the hope. You're still here. You're still listening, still wondering, still imagining what could have been, and what still could be. And that means the library isn't dead. Not really, because the Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building. It was a belief that we can understand the world, that we can ask questions without fear. That truth belongs to everyone, not just those in power. That belief lives wherever someone dares to ask, what if there's more? So now I'll ask you, what will you do with this story? Will it end here, as an interesting video, a cool piece of history, or will it echo? Will it change the way you read, listen, speak? Will it make you pause just a little longer before sharing that post or dismissing that idea? Because Alexandria didn't fall in a day, and it won't rise again in one either. But every time we protect curiosity, every time we ask instead of assume, every time we make space for the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, we rebuild it, scroll by scroll, word by word, mind by mind. So if this story meant something to you, share it, not just for the algorithm, but for the memory of what was lost, and the future that's still possible, because the next Library of Alexandria won't be made of marble or papyrus. It will be made of us, of how we speak, how we learn, how we remember. And maybe, just maybe, next time someone tries to silence the truth, we won't be quiet. We'll be a chorus, whispering across time, let there be light. When the last question goes unasked, the fire wins again.